Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Center for Public Justice's 26th annual Kuyper Lecture. I'm Stephanie Summers, and I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Justice. I want to start tonight just by thanking our host, Rick Berry, who is seated up here in the front with Rick. Rick leads the Center for Christian Civics, which is a nonpartisan ministry promoting healthy witness and discipleship in the face of partisan polarization. They do this through classes, coaching, and online courses, and they empower the church to think, speak, and act differently in the public square. Rick, thank you for everything that you have done to make this evening possible. When we planned this year's Kuyper Lecture, we could not have imagined that we would be up against a government shutdown on the date we were originally intending to have our lecture. Our Senate sponsors came to us the week of and said, we're definitely going to shut down, you need to move. And then we planned our B date tonight against another potential government shutdown deadline. And they said, please don't try, just find somewhere else. We like you a lot, we can't help you. And Rick came to the rescue. And I just want to say something about this man's heart because, I was sort of saying to him, we got this news dilemma. And he's like, I have space, I can help you. And he has gone above and beyond space. So we're really grateful for Rick. Our agenda this evening is simple. I will just give a few minutes of remarks to provide some context for our lecture. I will briefly introduce our lecturer and our discussant, and then we're going to hear from Rachel Hope Anderson as our 26th Kuyper lecturer. And our discussant, Stanley Carlson-Thies, will make some brief remarks in response, and then the three of us will talk together for a few minutes before we move to a moderated time of questions with you. So if you've got questions going on in your mind through the time, think about forming your question into a question. So the Center for Public Justice is a nonpartisan Christian civic education and public policy organization. We seek to inspire and equip Christians to pursue a common calling to faithful citizenship and to affirm the vital role of government in upholding public justice. And our Kuyper Lecture is named for Abram Kuyper, an influential Dutch scholar-statesman whose many contributions to public life influence Christians today. Kuyper believed that Christian life cannot be confined to church life, and accepting Christ's claim of authority over the entire world, he sought to follow the implications of that faith into politics, journalism, the university, and other human endeavors. Kuyper became well known for leading the work of what was called the anti-revolutionary movement, and his key insights led to his robust criticism of individualist forces that were the kind of backbone of revolutionary idealism. Kuyper and the anti-revolutionaries offered a far broader understanding of how human life is organized, including the role of institutions and the forms of work that honor the social dimension of human nature. In this evening's Kuyper Lecture, Who's Caring for Children?, you will hear themes informed by Kuyper's life and practice. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our Kuyper lecturer. Rachel Hope Anderson has extensive experience at the intersection of faith and early childhood policy. She founded and currently serves as a strategic advisor to the Families Valued program at the Center for Public Justice and has served as the primary investigator for CPJ's 3 state studies on faith-based childcare. Previously, she served as the director of faith affairs at the Center for Responsible Lending, where she formed and led a cross-ideological religious coalition to rein in predatory payday lending. Ms. Anderson brings a background in community organizing, advocacy, and spiritual formation to her consulting work and is committed to the practice of pluralism, helping those with deep differences to work together with mutual respect toward a shared common good. She is a graduate of Harvard Law and Divinity Schools. And after Ms. Anderson makes her remarks, we will have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Stanley Carlson-Thies in response. Rachel, welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to just start and especially thank the staff of the Center for Public Justice, Stephanie and Stanley, and the trustees who are here tonight. If the tenor and content of this evening is unique, it is because of the community cultivated over many decades of those affiliated with the Center for Public Justice, those who steward it, those who carry out its mission, those who've interned and served as staff. So thank you to all of you, as well as everyone who has come to join us this evening. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic drew new attention to childcare in America. Parents scrambled to balance work and care for young children under quarantine conditions. Childcare providers sought creative ways to stay open and to pay their staff. After allocating an initial round of stabilization funds, the US Congress also started taking a look at childcare. Leaders started planning a major investment in childcare and early education within the 2021 Build Back Better legislation. Proponents deemed it the most transformative investment in children and caregiving in generations. But policy debate surrounding the legislation was sometimes less transformative. Often rhetoric fell along predictable fault lines. On the one hand, some people talked about childcare as infrastructure. In April of 2021, a senator tweeted, "Paid leave is infrastructure, childcare is infrastructure, caregiving is infrastructure." Another member of Congress said, "Just like our roads and bridges, childcare fuels the economy." And a New York Times writer around the same time explained and defined childcare as what enables parents to get to work. This language sounded familiar. In 1973, in the wake of another moment of intense political debate about childcare, the Catholic writer Margaret Steinfels mapped the landscape of childcare policies. What were the different visions on this landscape? Well, she offered three prominent types, one of which she described as realization. Within the framework of realization, childcare policy, Steinfels explained, should maximize the productive market capacities of women and children alike, enabling women to take jobs in the economy while preparing children, ultimately, to take their place in the paid workforce when their time arrives. Critics of the Build Back Better Act also sounded historically familiar themes. They feared that the law would involve the federal government too intensively in family life and discriminate against stay-at-home parents. Expanded child care funding represented, according to a senator, a turn towards communism that would incentivize women to rely on the federal government to organize their lives. These arguments have also been made before. In 1971, President Nixon vetoed legislation that would have allocated new federal resources to child care, stating that he feared it would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of communal approaches to child rearing over against the family-centered approach. Another often repeated childcare type that Steinfels chronicled is childcare as patchwork. Childcare, so this vision goes, is primarily a service for families who are facing a particular and temporary challenge. Childcare helps patch a family situation together while parents attempt to land breadwinning jobs. Through the patchwork lens, childcare is often viewed as a way to compensate for perceived deficits in family capacity, be they poverty, mental health, or single parenting. In both the 1970s and the 2020s, fears about childcare as a rival to the family appeared just as childcare policies sought to reach beyond this patchwork model. And with the defeat of Build Back Better, as with Nixon's 1971 veto, the gravitational center of childcare policy returned to that of patchwork. That's where it's remained for some time. The core federal investment in childcare comes from the Child Care Development Block Grant, which was created by Congress in the early 90s and then expanded in 1996, along with a historic package of welfare reforms. Its overarching goal was to help usher welfare-supported households into the paid workforce using a series of carrots and sticks. Sticks being limits on cash assistance, and carrots including subsidized childcare vouchers. The patchwork model remains core to federal childcare policy, but so do worries about care and family for many American households, extending beyond those who need a temporary fix. According to Pew Research Center, for example, about half of working parents with children in the home say it's difficult to handle childcare responsibilities. Numerous surveys, including those by Barna and other religious researchers, identify a great deal of stress experienced by American households, and particularly by women. The Center for Public Justice has sought to do its part in understanding childcare policy beyond the familiar frameworks by considering a particular segment of the childcare ecosystem, faith-based childcare providers. Starting in 2021, I was privileged to work with partners at DataWise Consulting and at the Baylor Institute for the Study of Religion to begin examining faith-based childcare in 3 states, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Georgia. This research, while still in progress, might offer some new perspectives beyond those that address childcare as mainly a rival to the nuclear family, those who see it as remediation, or those who envision it principally as infrastructure. CPJ and our research partners interviewed over 24 men and women engaged in the childcare field. We talked to staff at a Catholic preschool, the early education director at a Jewish community center, a pastor whose church hosts daycare, and many others. We listened to women who had turned their homes into places of childcare. None of these individuals positioned themselves as alternatives to families. None of them thought of themselves as part of the infrastructure either. The theme often sounded in these interviews was a sense of vocation. Childcare is not for the faint of heart, they told us, but it is the work that I'm called to do. As I continue, I'll share some of what these childcare providers and supporters shared with us, using some of their stories but not their names or their other identifying features. Barbara felt called to the work of childcare after losing a child to miscarriage. She's worked in the field since 2008, caring for children in her home daily while her husband helps her with managing the business side of the family daycare. She sees herself as a partner with God in the nurture and safety of young children. She says, "I'm trusting God to send me the kids that need to be here." Amanda thought she would have a career in business, but she started teaching preschool because she said, in her words, she realized she wanted to work in an atmosphere that was more like a family than a factory. Now, as the program director, she devotes herself to creating a culture of joy, calm, and fun for both staff and children. The Christian tradition understands work as integral to human life. The text of Genesis contains God's summons to work in broad terms: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and steward it. Modern theologians have extrapolated extensively from these verses, generating a wide range of examples of righteous work. Martin Luther, for example, hailed the cobbler, the smith, the farmer, and the person who scours the dishes, all as responding to God's divine call. Ancient biblical accounts provide us with examples of vocation as well. The first chapter of the book of Exodus describes two women who are identified by their line of work. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. They are midwives. We learn about them in the context of a truly harrowing story, one that I invite you to hear tonight with care, particularly now that war reminds us of the vulnerability of peoples and the fragility of human life. The first chapter of Exodus describes the king of Egypt seeking to contain the Hebrew population in his nation's midst. He attempts to enroll midwives into a genocidal plan, commanding them to put to death any male child they deliver. Shiphrah and Puah cannily refuse to comply, saying that the women in their community are strong and no longer need them to aid them in birth. The story of the midwives fits within the biblical narrative, prefiguring a coming liberation, but it is worth taking time to consider Shiphrah and Puah themselves. It was their daily work as midwives that positioned them for cooperation with God's great liberation. As women who were practiced in coaxing life from death, they were prepared to resist a death-dealing command. There are narrative details that further point to Shiphrah and Puah as women with vocations. A tool of their trade is mentioned in the text, a birth stool or birth brick. Some interpreters surmise that the women are representatives of a whole community of midwives, a guild of sorts. It is clear from the narrative that they have a particular social stature because of their work. It is because of this stature that the king approaches them as an access point to the Hebrew community. The story of the midwives can inform our contemporary perspective on the relationship between work, family, and community. In this story, Hebrew families were not isolated. They weren't reliant only on their own capabilities or defenses. They were part of a community, a network of social relationships through which God supported and protected them. In the Exodus account, the contours of a differentiated social life appear, even within circumstances of oppression. There are families, and there is economic life, but there is more to a society than that. Christian theology that follows in the vein of figures like Abraham Kuyper contend that human flourishing requires diverse social spaces. God's creation mandate summons people to create a wide array of institutions, each with their own purposes. In other words, creation is not a monoculture, but rather an ecosystem. There are schools and workplaces, community groups, families, congregations. From this perspective, and with the model of the midwives in mind, we should question ideas about childcare that are too reductive. Understanding childcare only as infrastructure reduces caregiving to a function of the economy. By the same measure, it is incorrect to think of childcare as merely a rival to healthy family life, or even a band-aid to apply to broken households. Instead, in a healthy society, there are those who, like the midwives, companion families as they bear and raise children and contribute to the development of those children. Likewise, today, there are early education teachers, aunts who pay special attention to children in their neighborhood or congregation, families who offer their homes for daycare. Kuyperian-inspired thinkers see our contemporary life as a morally infused and even intricate social landscape in which each type of institution should be allowed its own space, its own sphere. With respect to care for children, psychologist Alison Gopnik agrees. In her book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, she contends that child development, particularly in the vulnerable and vibrant first years, requires from adults a unique mix of caring, freedom, attention, and love. We need to recognize, she says, that caring for children isn't just like other kinds of human activities. Raising children is special, and it needs and deserves its own brand of thinking, its own set of political and economic institutions. A just society, then, is one in which these diverse spaces of human activity can flourish, each on their own terms. This is true for families as well as those who are called to companion them. The difficult truth, however, is that having a calling, as many childcare providers shared with us, can be profoundly costly. The women and men we spoke to were exhausted and financially vulnerable. One woman explained, "In childcare, expectations are so high and the pay is so low." She notes that childcare workers are barely paid over minimum wage. Another shared, "You have to love your job to work in daycare. It is strenuous, physically demanding, and emotionally exhausting. It is well worth it, but it is tiring." She understood why fellow childcare workers were leaving that line of work for jobs in retail and fast food. The current median pay for those whose daily work is childcare is just over $13 an hour. And in every state, the poverty rate for childcare workers exceeds that of the population as a whole. Providers worry about having enough food, paying off educational debts, or keeping up with the rent or mortgage payments. Notably, for home-based providers, that's the source of their livelihood. So those working in childcare can even end up risking their own and their children's well-being, even as they invest in others' welfare. Several years ago, a woman named Alicia shared her experience with the Center for Public Justice. As a teacher in a community daycare, where she had worked for several years, she was not offered paid family leave. Her boss allowed her 2 weeks time off after giving birth, and she couldn't afford to take any additional time off. So she returned to work with her newborn son in tow, helping to care for him alongside the other children at the child care center. Her son soon contracted a respiratory virus, likely the result of being continuously exposed to many other children, something many new parents would know well. In this case, ultimately, he was hospitalized and endured respiratory issues throughout his whole first year. For Alicia, the daily work of childcare was so demanding that it diminished her own ability to recover from childbirth and capacity to care for her own son. There's no simple explanation for chronically low pay and inadequate working conditions for women and men who undertake childcare work. Economists try to make sense of several factors. It is difficult for the market to reward those whose work is really part of a long horizon of human development. Healthy children do ultimately contribute to a healthy society and a robust economy, but this benefit appears long after babies have been fed and sung to, or children have graduated from nap and story time. Historically, childcare roles have been filled by workers with fewer other options, such as women of color who face discrimination in other occupations. Some economists believe that the intrinsic motivation caregivers bring to their work can limit pay. Workers with a sense of calling may be less likely to switch fields or positions, thus limiting their opportunities to bargain for better pay. And because their very vocation involves accompanying families, many childcare providers are very sympathetic to families' financial limits and reluctant to raise their prices. So a society in which an intrinsically valuable and socially important form of work is severely underpaid, to the point that workers sacrifice their own welfare, decent living, food security, and ability to raise their family well, may be economically explicable, but it is not morally justifiable. There are ways to right this situation. During the pandemic, many states funneled COVID-related assistance to childcare workers directly in the form of direct payments and bonuses. And this was a very memorable intervention to the many childcare providers that CPJ interviewed. Judy, who runs a family-based daycare, used a monthly COVID stipend to lower fees for families who she understood to be even worse off than she was. But nevertheless, she found herself struggling, and she worried about what would happen after those payments subsided, as they now have. She said, "I know I can't cut back on groceries. I can't cut back on power and water." Today, some states, both red and blue, are examining ways to address provider wages more sustainably. North Carolina, Illinois, and Louisiana offer childcare workers wage subsidies and stipends that help nudge their pay toward a living wage. Other states are addressing health insurance gaps for childcare workers by subsidizing their premiums on state healthcare exchanges. And last year, Nebraska state legislators introduced a bill that would enable childcare workers to join the same insurance pool that covers the state's school districts. Remembering and looking at childcare through the lens of vocation also helps us understand that work is rarely a solitary activity, but one practiced in what Catholics call a community of work. It happens through the give and take of learning and mentorship. We heard about this as well. One of our interviewees, Rose, started providing childcare many years ago out of necessity. She was a single mother who needed to earn a living. But over the years, childcare became her life's work. In fact, she cared for many generations, she said, in the same family. But that work has also meant lifelong learning for her. She said that just a few years ago, she was enabled by a farm-to-table program to start a garden outside of her home daycare, something new for her. Meanwhile, regional licensors often refer less experienced childcare providers to Rose for advice. There are many policy approaches that recognize the social aspect of vocation. Many states have registered apprenticeship programs for those working in childcare, and Congress has opportunities to expand those offerings. In other states, childcare unions are developing training programs for new workers or workers who want to shift from direct care to operating their own program. All of these policies that directly support pay, benefits, enrichment for childcare workers also have the advantage of working with the grain of America's childcare system, which is extraordinarily diverse. Faith-based care is a part of this diversity, and I'll share that since that's the piece that we've been looking at. We know that at least 6% of early education programs are sponsored by a religious institution, but from our surveys, it suggests that a much higher number could be considered faith-based. In Michigan, we discovered that at least 15% of licensed childcare providers and 20% of centers were faith-based. And the initial results of surveys in Georgia and Massachusetts indicate that many home-based providers bring faith into their work and could be considered faith-based from the perspective of daily practice. So these are the folks that lead lunchtime prayers around the kitchen table, break up the day with praise music, and mix Charlotte Mason text with Montessori methods. We've been looking at the faith-based sector, but we're sure this kind of novelty exists across the childcare field, not only in faith-based providers. Childcare settings are likely as diverse as American families and communities are. Critics of the Build Back Better approach worried that it prioritized standardization over diversity. Along with additional funding to states and care providers, the law sought to expand a set of norms about how childcare should operate. It conditioned subsidies to providers on their meeting licensing and quality and other standards. It conditioned money to states on a variety of factors, from design of their quality rating system to reimbursement. Additionally, it designated a greater portion of its funds as federal financial assistance, a category which applies more, not less, restriction on the religious expression of childcare providers. Presented as it was within the framework of infrastructure, there was understandable worry about government insensitivity to the local and the unique. Just as urban redevelopment projects bulldoze neighborhoods, certain approaches to childcare could end up flattening family and community distinctives. There's more to say about how we can do this well, and I think we'll be able to continue this discussion later in the evening. But I think we should start simply by naming government's role in childcare as directional, shifting focus and resources to activities that are vital for the whole of society, but are at risk of underinvestment. When this vital work of caregiving is overlooked, the result can be burnout. This is a burnout business, one center director told us. If you don't do it, there's no way to get that concept. You're carrying so much. It is a burden to carry daily. She shared this at the same time that she shared that she spends time each day praying for the families who entrust children to her care. This, in a way, is part of the burden she carries for them. Thinking of her words makes me suggest that those who have taken to calling childcare infrastructure are in their own way trying to explain this burden to the wider society. The care and development of young children is work that benefits society and the economy on a generational scale. It's reasonable for all members of society to support this work. The idea that childcare is infrastructure, when voiced by caregivers themselves, is a way of naming their calling as a worthy work that should be given its due. In the ancient story of the midwives, God himself gave faithful workers their due. The text says, God made it go well with the midwives. And inasmuch as the midwives feared God, he made households for them, for their attention to the vulnerable and their care for families. They were rewarded with the security of their own home. They were blessed with the opportunity to see their own families flourish. So too should today's midwives, the childcare workers, birth workers, preschool teachers, who labor to support others' families, be enabled to fulfill their calling and to make a home for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd like to turn to Stanley Carlson-Thies, and then I will move us to questions. I'm just going to do a brief intro for Stanley. I meant to do this earlier. Stanley Carlson-Thies is the founder and senior director of the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance, which is a division of the Center for Public Justice. And as part of his role, he convenes the Coalition to Preserve Religious Freedom, which is a multi-faith alliance of faith-based social service, education, and religious freedom organizations that advocates for the religious freedom of these organizations to Congress and the federal government, and engages and advises federal and state officials in developing policies and practices to this end. He served in the inaugural Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the White House, and his recent contribution to the Rutledge Handbook of Religious Literacy, Pluralism, and Global Engagement focuses on faith-based social services. He is also co-author with Stephen Monsma of Free to Serve, Protecting the Religious Freedom of Faith-Based Organizations. Stanley, welcome.
Well, Rachel's painted for us a rich, detailed, vivid, and insightful picture of childcare in the United States in our time. So thank you, Rachel, for inviting us to understand childcare as a calling and childcare institutions as civil society institutions. So I want to offer some comments that I hope will kind of expand on the discussion she initiated. But before those comments, I want to thank everybody who's here tonight and those who will listen to the recording later. This is a time of many disturbing trends in our society. Trends, thoughts, actions, it's tempting to just focus on those. But in my view, such a time as this should be also a time for fundamental reflection and foundational concern, a time to consider carefully what is good and what must be better in our common life together, foundational inquiry and discussion keep us from being merely reactive and defensive. And especially in a time of turmoil, we need constructive and hopeful thinking and action. So thank you for joining us for this discussion. I want to make two comments in response to Rachel's lecture. The first is about civil society, and the second is about public policy for childcare. In particular, which one of two ready-to-hand models should guide the constructive new childcare policy that's needed. So first, civil society. Rachel's descriptions and analysis help us to see childcare as a unique part of civil society, a unique calling that is related in distinct ways to other activities and institutions, and that for its health needs government policy that acknowledges and supports its uniqueness. I'm struck by testimony from the childcare sphere that Rachel's research has revealed. That is, childcare workers who regard their labors to be a unique calling on behalf of the children and not simply as a particular way to earn an income, and childcare program owners and managers who regard their work as supporting families and not as a rival to those families. That is, childcare is not just a service that supports the economy, and it's not an alternative to family care. It is a support or a companion for families. Regarding childcare in this way requires breaking out of our all too habitual way of thinking about society and public policy. What is that habitual way? Well, years ago in her book, Rights Talk, The Impoverishment of Political Discourse, Mary Ann Glendon, the distinguished Catholic legal scholar and former U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, observed that in American discussions of public policy, we too often have in our minds what she called the familiar individual, state, and market grid. Individual, state, and market. That is, when we think of what's going on in public affairs and what needs to be made better in our common life, we think of individuals, what's going wrong and right in the economy, and then what we should tell government to do or stop doing. But a lot's left out of that mental picture. Notably, civil society is missing. Families, houses of worship, childcare centers, private schools, adoption agencies, emergency shelters, such as gospel rescue missions, service clubs, art galleries, and much more. This is a grave defect for policymaking, overlooking the distinctive qualities and practices and values of a large proportion of the institutions through which we live our lives and on whose health we depend. Paying close attention to childcare as a civil society institution, as Rachel has helped us to do, forces us to look beyond that limited triangular grid that Mary Ann Glendon noted. We have to think of civil society institutions, not just individuals, and to recognize childcare as a civil society institution draws our attention to connections, how the sector is related to persons, families, other institutions, and not just the government and businesses. And also the civil society perspective should make us ask careful questions about what an appropriate public policy will be, not just more money or less regulation or more regulation, right? What's the nature of that sector? As Rachel suggested, a strength of the neo-Kuyperian perspective that guides the Center for Public Justice and to which we draw attention in this annual lecture is that it highlights civil society institutions and how important it is that government officials understand such institutions and not just individuals in the economy when they design and implement public policy. So I want to add the acknowledgement that this insight into civil society and good public policy is also a major strength of Catholic social teaching, and you'll see the depth of that understanding in Mary Ann Glendon's book that I mentioned, Rights Talk, and in other works of hers, and also the works of other Catholic scholars. Well, what then about better public policy that would strengthen the child care sector? This is my second comment. Rachel gave good reasons why the child care sector needs better public policy. It needs more money from fees that parents pay, from government, from other sources, but it also needs a better overall framework. She said that the government should adopt a stewardship role that means constructive and careful policy, and it should not just react in a crisis management way. There needs to be systematic policy. So how should that policy be guided? I think there are two ready-to-hand policy models that could guide the constructive child care policy that's needed. One is public school system, and the other is a system that structures the child care funding provided by the federal government already. She mentioned that. But first, let me highlight one central aspect of child care, as she did. Child care is a diverse world, and I mean diverse not only because of the great variety of child care centers and home child care settings. I mean the approaches and the environment for the care is varied. Child care that is preparation for formal schooling, child care that maximizes play or socialization, child care that respects Islamic conceptions, child care that uses a Southern Baptist curriculum and includes Bible stories and teaches biblical values, child care that follows Jewish dietary rules and observes Jewish holidays, and a lot more. Child care is religiously and ideologically diverse because families have different commitments and values, different aspirations and fundamental beliefs. Child care should support, and at the least not conflict with, those family convictions, values, and ideas. Okay, so there needs to be a better public policy, something beyond the patchwork current reality, more of a system, more public funding, so that the child care sector can be strengthened with adequate funding to sustain child care organizations and child care staff. So what model can appropriately guide the needed expanded public policy and funding? So as I said, one of the close at hand policy models is our public school system. These schools are meant to be appropriate for all children, and so their teaching and values are supposed to be suitable for all families. That's the common school. But note, because public schools are government schools, they are non-religious schools. They have to be. That makes them not the choice favored by many families, the many families that regard religious teaching and religion-based values as important in their lives and in the education of their children. And of course, families vary on many other important values matters as well. Our pre-K through high school system, I think, only barely accommodates families with convictions that differ from the majority. Such families, but only if they have sufficient resources of their own, can search out other schools than the public schools. Various school choice policies are trying to make such alternatives more accessible to more families, but the public school model itself is not designed to reflect fundamental religious and values diversity. But there is another close at hand policy model. In fact, the model that has guided federal child care policy since its major step forward in 1990, and Rachel named this, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, or here in Washington, CCDBG. So remember those 5 initials, CCDBG. Now sometimes called the Child Care Development Fund, provides federal funding to states to subsidize child care for low-income families. This federal program was designed from the start, 1990, to support religiously diverse child care programs. Some of the federal money goes directly to child care providers, and that grant or contract subsidized care is required to be secular without any religious teaching or religiously selected staff. But states are required to offer parents the option of a child care certificate or voucher, which they can use to receive subsidized care from a provider of their choice. And when that is a form of payment, then it can be accepted by providers who offer distinctively religious child care and that hire religiously qualified staff. Let me emphasize that the federal child care funding can pay for religious child care and not only secular child care, thanks to rules CCDBG adopted more than 3 decades ago. This gives lower income families a choice among providers with different approaches and different values. I think CCDBG is a model to follow, but adequate child care policy has to go beyond it. For one thing, the federal funds don't go nearly far enough at the moment. And it's not easy to strengthen a network of service providers when the funding method is vouchers instead of grants or contracts. Creative new public policy making is needed. Fortunately, there's a version of contracts that carries all of the religious freedom of vouchers, and I think that's what would be needed. Well, because childcare is a calling, and because childcare programs should be compatible with and support the diverse values and beliefs of families, I think it's essential that the advances in government policy and government funding that is needed ought to be modeled on the pluralistic Child Care and Development Block Grant and not the uniformity of the public school system. Policy that is fundamentally pluralistic will best serve diverse parents, and it can also draw into the system childcare entrepreneurs and faith-based childcare programs that are motivated by the love of God as well as the love of children. So if any of you have a hand in public policy making for childcare, remember those initials, CCDBG. Thank you.
Thank you both for illuminating us with your conversation. I'm going to kick it off with a few questions for our discussion, and so you can spend some time thinking about yours. Yeah, Ryan, are we good? Okay. So Rachel, starting with you. At the outset of the lecture, you helpfully highlighted that the current public views and predictable fault lines about childcare are not new, but have been frameworks used in our policy discussions since well before either one of us was even a child in care. My hope is that 50 years from now, our country can look back on this season in our public life and see that a new framework began taking hold in our understanding and shaping of childcare policy. So this is a question for both of you. What are the essential features of that framework to which we should aspire? And do either one of you want to venture to give it a name?
That's the hard part, right? So I'll quickly say, elements of the structure, a big piece of what I shared is that childcare and early learning should be sustainable and respected work. And that's for both parents and care workers. So, policies that are directed at this sphere should be, I think, kind of foundationally thinking about that. And then when we're thinking about the standards and best practices that are either required or incentivized by policy, those should really focus on what matters most. I am not an expert, for anybody. I'll give you a little secret on the childcare research that we did. I think all of us who got started with this research project, in addition to the qualitative interviews, we issued surveys to the whole population of childcare providers in our 2 focus states. But we are all, at each step of the way, shocked by how complex childcare administration is in the United States and the wide variations that exist from state to state. So I'm not going to spend my time here kind of pulling apart all of those systems, nor critiquing their complexity, nor attempting to master them. I think I just want to name that I think what those systems should be aiming for is to be promoting what matters most in care settings. And those include attention and warmth from caregivers. There is good research that says that children fare best in childcare when on the basis of the quality of attention that they receive from care providers. Adequate staffing does contribute to that, and so that's important. Age-appropriate ladders of play and exploration, the health of the environment, and security and stability as exercised by people and routines. So all of those are kind of what the standards should be aiming for. And then if I were to sum it up, I'm not yet ready to coin a phrase, but it would be something around childcare and family care as foundational.
I think often in Washington, public policy is more or less of something. And here would be a really good example when that's not adequate. There needs to be not just more funding, more regulation, less regulation. But this is a really complex set of institutions and care. If nothing else, just think about the parents who need care that's overlaps their work, but they work a second shift. That's just very different. And are there enough of parents who need that in a particular area? So how to handle that, and so on and so on. So this is really a place that needs to be something other than more or less. I think more or less is just an easy way for the two parties to wrangle about these things. And somehow this kind of policy has to be taken out of that kind of wrangling back and forth, and then people who want to really focus on, what is there and what's the nature of the care. I think one thing I would just recommend, as I indicated, is to build in fundamental, clear, solid, and public protection for religious and philosophical difference. And if that's not really clearer than it is currently, I think, even in red states, then a lot of providers who could be in a more systematic system just hang back because they think the only way they can protect themselves is by staying out of it. So the system has to be very clear that they're welcomed in as they are, as parts of a very diverse system. And you wanted to know what it should be called?
Yeah. Do you have the name?
CCDBG. No. No, it's a good question. And, we're not Capitol Hill staff, so it's not our job to come up with acronyms. So
Hopefully it's not an acronym. Something
Great.
isn't-
Thank you. Well, you can help us. You have a challenge before you know. In your remarks, you both pointed to a prevailing reductionism, right? A flattening out of the important distinctives and features that you were describing. You also shared some good examples of ways that we are seeing policies and providers try to remedy the flattening out. Yet, we unfortunately continue to see what I would call well-meaning but pervasive attempts to boil childcare down to something like a math problem, right? X children in need of care equals find corresponding number of seats in centers, irrespective of things like geographic location or a family's social capital in their own community or the prevalence of institutional or home-based providers in the neighborhood in which they live. What would you specifically encourage state and local policymakers to keep in mind as they're examining their existing policies governing childcare?
Sure, I'll just make one comment. A portion of federal child care funding, every state has to have a plan for how it's going to use the money. A portion of that money goes to fund child care resource and referral networks. So every county has them. Typically, it's a contract with a nonprofit of some kind. And they're supposed to find out where all the child care providers are, what the need is, where these places are located. They run a referral system so you can look up on the web or make a phone call and find out who's close by. One thing that's been missing from that system is to identify the approach or style of the provider. Is this Southern Baptist? Is this Montessori type or whatever? It's just kind of crazy. The whole system is that federally funded system is supposed to be built on choice. They talk about choice in the regulations, in the statute, talk about religious choice, all that kind of stuff. And then they don't give parents an indicator of this really important choice. I think if they would highlight that, that would be one thing that would make clear to them the kind of diversity that's out there. And I think that would help policymakers and providers, and then these resource networks who are supposed to be out there cultivating more providers. It would help them better understand what they are trying to do.
So it should be free response answers from childcare providers, not just checking a box.
Yeah. Right.
I think that's interesting because in our research, we were coming to understand how frequently states do or don't track even just faith affiliation or faith, being identified as a faith-based provider, which is very important for providers. Only one of the 3 states has any formal way to express that. And yet, in our surveys, there's a fairly high rate of expression and people, even as I mentioned a bit in the speech, even home-based providers who wouldn't kind of be part of your typical mental model of faith-based providers, right? You think about the child care center in the church basement, maybe. I hope it's not in the basement. But child care program in the, in a religious building as the paradigm, but actually lots of home-based providers just volunteered in the survey something about their faith identity, and likewise might be interested in sharing other pieces of their philosophy. I'll actually just give a kind of turn this question around a bit and offer maybe a provocative account of the current reductionism that we have. And I'll describe that as kind of, the intensity of requirements that were coming from the federal legislation, especially this most recent round, and actually suggest that it might be because childcare right now is built on this patchwork model, and by that I also mean it's called compensatory, right? Childcare in that model is making up for some deficit in the family, and it's really aimed at originally helping this small set of families get from welfare into the workforce. And I think we see historically when policies are organized around that kind of maybe very small, particular, high need population, lawmakers are very concerned about kind of carrots and sticks. And are people receiving this benefit and doing what's intended with it? And I tend to think that same model has just kind of pervaded the system. So it's much more about compliance than it is empowerment, for example, or it runs the risk of being that way. So that's another one of the reasons why I think we do need to shift a little bit away from just this patchwork model, thinking that childcare policy is just for this small set of most disadvantaged families.
Great, thank you. The multifaceted framework that you both described seems to stand in contrast to another emerging framework, one that potentially ties childcare even more closely to what Steinfels called that realization framework back from before we were born. And as we've been conducting this state research on faith-based childcare, we have encountered this framework both in state policy and in efforts undertaken by employers who are trying to solve the childcare crisis in their community through center-based care offered in workplaces. In both cases, state systems and more businesses are framing childcare as workforce development. I'm looking at you, Texas, and Walmart. This is Sunday's paper. Can you comment on your concerns about how this workforce development framework, sort of who and what this framework is leaving behind?
Well, I guess I'll say first for the policy people in this room, if working with employers is a way to incrementally move forward, I don't want to discourage that effort. I think many of us do often feel like it's an all hands on deck. But I think that there is a kind of a framing concern, and there's a concern about how that may even spill over to other policy domains. And so basically, if childcare is only thought of as an assistant to the workforce, it can kind of make us blind to how workforces are actually treating their employees. I'll give you a quick example. Over the past few years, as I've been talking with policymakers about this, I've been asked several times actually about this particular situation, the situation of someone who's in a kind of a just-in-time job where they're called up by the retail. They work at like a retail store, and they're called up within the week and given their hours, and they need to show up to work not on a schedule that they hadn't prepared for. And I've been asked in that instance, as well as in the instance of people who are working around the clock in call centers and warehouses, if would this be an opportunity for the churches to step in and provide that just-in-time care? So a parent could drop off their child at the church when they've been called in just in time to their job, and they're fearing that they'll lose their job if they don't show up. or they're asked, like, well, wouldn't it be better if kids who need to stay in childcare overnight while their mom is working in a call center, wouldn't it be better if the churches stepped up and cared for them? And in the immediate sense, absolutely. But I do not think that is a way to treat families and children. And so there is this risk of thinking about the childcare system and as a kind of absorbing the externalities of forms of work that are not helpful for families.
So I'd say it's not a good way to treat a church either.
Right.
A church can have a childcare ministry, but that's different than the church and its own internal work. It reminded me of back in the mid-'90s when Congress passed charitable choice, trying to get more faith-based organizations involved in social services by clarifying the freedoms and protections they would have. I talked to people from a church in, I think it was Denver, and we were talking about this policy, how it was working out in Colorado and so on. They said, well, one thing that we've discovered is that people in need, families in need, moms with kids, dependent children, they were being sent to us from the county welfare officials, and they just sent them to us with this message: you're the church, you're responsible to take care of us, so what are you going to do? No funding, no grants, no communication to them, just it's your job, here they are. That's not good either, so this is bad all around to do that. I think there's an irony that Child Care and Development Block Grant, that was workforce development. That's what the model was. But it had built into this just diversity and didn't have enough system in it, and certainly not enough money, but it has built into this diversity that I think is really important. On the other hand, the current workforce development model doesn't. And one thing that's been happening over the last number of months is that the Biden administration has been saying, for example, that companies that want to get some of the CHIPS money for CHIPS factories and so on, they have to dedicate part of that funding to childcare for their workers. Well, what kind of childcare is it going to be? In the back room? Is they're going to contract with a childcare provider, and that's the one you have to use because that's the only one that's going to be subsidized? And there's an executive order that suggests across many programs in the federal government, different pieces of money will be picked off and be spent on childcare. But all of this is separate from a system that's carefully designed to provide some structure, some information, referral, and diversity. I think that's like the worst kind of workforce development. So I think Congress is in a very, let's say, a reactive mode to the extent that it's doing things in this kind of policy. And that's not a good way to make policy for this kind of issue.
Yes. This is my last question for these two. So if you are thinking about your question, get ready. Your turn is coming soon. Rachel, you foregrounded the voices of child caregivers in your lecture, and it offers a really important lens through which to have this conversation. As a team, and in other contexts, we've discussed at great lengths the state and federal policy interaction and its impact on the caregivers themselves. And this interaction featured in our research as we worked to understand the very complicated state systems that Rachel mentioned. Some of the research that we conducted was research that was being done during the pandemic. And ultimately, the American Rescue Plan had some funds that were block granted to the states in response to the public health emergency to provide resources for providers. Would you comment about what seemed to work well in that, and what worked maybe not so well in an emergency situation that might be important to keep in mind as we go forward into a time where, the people who are part of the caregiving ecosystem would agree we're in a child care crisis, albeit no longer in a public health emergency?
Well, as I mentioned, one part of that funding made its way directly to childcare providers in the form of monthly stipends, bonuses, and so forth. And that was incredibly beneficial. Like many of the people that we spoke to brought it up and said, you know, we were able to stay afloat. We were able to accomplish something because we had that support. Why couldn't that just become the norm? So that was very beneficial. I have not yet seen research. I know there are people very interested in this question, really tracking and analyzing how all of those monies were used and flowed through states and their impact on childcare during the pandemic and after. But I think we should all be looking out for that research. But we also kind of heard anecdotally that because the money came through this format of federal financial assistance, faith-based providers, particularly those who kind of, I hate to say it, had lawyers available to them, were kind of resistant to accepting it because they were concerned that it would come with restrictions on their religious expression and identity. And that kind of, it seems like that sort of got worked out just on the fly during the pandemic, but it is the kind of concern that needs to be addressed more systemically going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's kind of an irony that if it's providers that had lawyers that were most concerned, you know, they're the ones who should have been able to look at the fine print and said, you don't have to worry. Congress wants you to be part of it. But in fact, there weren't all the protections, I think, that should have been there. And so some of them have gotten in trouble, some faith-based. Yeah. So that's just really unfortunate. I think the good thing was this was support for salaries and for the child care programs themselves. And it came in addition to the kind of variable flow of money that comes in from parents and the inadequate money that comes from federal subsidies. And so it was like I hate to use the term, an investment in the infrastructure of this sector, you know, not treating it as infrastructure, but in its basic, you know, the structures, the programs, the people that are involved. And that seems really important because the money that many parents can pay isn't enough to pay for that. So, but then the money has to come in a way that doesn't carry risks, I think, for organizations that care a lot about their faith identity.
Thank you. Now it's your turn. I'm going to ask that if you have a question, for the sake of our recording, Hoffa is going to move this microphone for you, and you're going to need to come to the microphone. So be brave. If you have a question, we want you to ask it. We are so grateful for you being here with us. Here's ground rules. If you could just say who you are, so these people know you're not, you know, talking to a stranger. If you want one of them rather than both of them, just say so. We want your real question. We also want questions that are concise, to the point, and relevant, and asked in the form of a question. Thank you.
Hi, David Jimenez, Niskanen Center. Great discussion and conversation. One I'd offer would be, I think on the Hill, there's a strong interest, especially on the center right, to make sure if you're pairing more resources and subsidies, you're also finding ways to control costs. And I think, Rachel, you made very clear that on the labor side, there's no more cost to be cut. If anything, workers need to be given more resources in terms of wages and healthcare. And we can only go so far in terms of safety regulations, given the population we're trying to serve. So I'd be curious, just on the red tape cost to Z side, which opportunities you do see to reduce costs in a way that isn't putting workers and obviously children further at risk.
Good first question.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the red tape, the regulatory burden, every regulation is written for a good purpose. And so I think what needs to be done is to look for, is it still necessary? Are there too many piling up and so on? Is there some other way to achieve that purpose without being so prescriptive? I think those are the real challenges. And I think it's a really difficult question, in part because the sector is so diverse, right? And because it's so diverse, I think it's tempting to say, here's a kind of like a long list of standard things you have to make sure you follow. And then even if you're, you do it in this kind of setting or that kind of setting, at least we know all those things are happening. But it could be that some of those goals could be better met in some of that diversity in a different way than the rules say. So that's not much of an answer, so sorry.
Goodness. I mean, broadly thinking, so here's a piece of information that comes out of a lot of surveys of parents, and that's the preference for home-based care. So there's some concern that kind of the shifting, so it's not the regulation itself, but kind of the shifting to regulation, those regulations are more readily met in center-based environments that are more expensive. So if you're thinking about kind of what are parents' inclinations towards home-based care and setting up a system that is kind of fully inclusive of home-based providers, that could be one that over time is a little bit more efficient than one that kind of moves entirely in the direction of center-based care.
Yeah, could I just add to that? I think to do that, to take home-based care really seriously, I think it's really important that childcare not be seen as like the first 3 years before pre-K, and then if you keep along this path, pretty soon you end up in Harvard or something like that. This is childcare, and it can have an educational component, but I don't think it's so good to think about it as, early schooling, something like that. And I think that's a pretty prominent idea out there. The quicker you get kids into a more formal setting, the better off they'll be later on. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but the more you think about it that way, the more the bias is towards centers, I think, and professionalized staff, because then they can have a curriculum and the whole 9 yards. So I think to kind of break away from that a little bit and say, well, we're developing pre-K, we've got a kindergarten and so on. Not every kid has to start going to school when they're 6 months old.
I'm trying to get a handle on the relationship between these civil society institutions like schools and families and businesses and childcare. What kind of I guess my question has to do with kind of a sociological or institutional arrangements. Is there anything that public policy might be able to do to encourage the connection or the relationships between families and schools and businesses in the child care space? I guess what I'm saying, there are all kinds of different child care, and as you move to professionalism, you lose some of that home warmth thing that was important for an effective child care setting. So I'm trying to figure out, is there anything that policy might be able to encourage that would help develop more civil society institutions that would be able to connect these various families with schools and with businesses and with child care providers, et cetera, in ways that would, in other words, is there something else that might be done besides money that can be done simply in terms of enriching the nature of the networks of civil society institutions that would be beneficial to child care?
Well, I guess I'll start with the Grand Rapids example, and it does involve money. But Grand Rapids is one of those communities that has, through I think a local referendum, enacted what they call a millage. So there's a local tax that they've raised to create their community's trust fund for a wide range of parent, child, and family programs. And it was very well regarded and supported by members of the business community, because I think they'd come to realize this longer term generational relationship between the health of families and the sustainability of their enterprises. So I think that is a really good example. And then just even thinking back to this question about what forms does childcare and family support take, that millage funds a really wide range of things, from parenting coaches to childcare programs. And I think that's really positive.
Funding, did it include both public and private funds and nonprofit
I don't know.
grants and stuff like that?
Knowing Grand Rapids, I think that it does, yes. All those streams of funding, but I don't know it specifically.
Yeah, I think in general, community-based and faith-based organizations kind of bring a network with them. And so that's just a way of connecting. And professionalized services, sometimes you absolutely need them. Like, I would rather go to the professionalized hospital than the surgeon attached to my church, if there was one. But I think in these things that have a lot to do with values, relationships, connections, then somehow connecting with something that's kind of locally invested in, looked to, that has other organic connections with people is a way of those connections just kind of come with it instead of artificially being built. So I'm not against professionalized childcare centers, but I think they can be a little bit divorced from that natural connectedness, and that may harm the cause. Yeah.
This will be our second to last question, so if you want to be the
Make it
last
good.
person, you gotta go up quick.
Hi, I'm Caleb. Thank you all. In your research, did you encounter any findings on the relationship between like the quality of childcare and outcomes later in life? And sort of what do you think about childcare policy as sort of being like upstream from all these other policy areas?
So our research, is not of the scope that could reach that question, but it is a very good one and well studied. And again, I think I'll just share what I mentioned before, which is that the most significant input in childcare that leads to success later is the quality of teacher and child interaction. And so thinking about maximizing that is probably a good start for thinking about how childcare can benefit children across the life course.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. It just strikes me, though, that if parents, because of their situation, need assistance, right? They need some out-of-home care, then, and they can't get something that's decent, then of course that child's going to end up in a much worse space. Just like if that child is at home with the parents and the parents don't know how to care well with it. So I guess to my mind, it's not, I don't know if I think much of the framework of kind of thinking like if we had really good inputs, 0 to 3 or 0 to 4, then all these kids would end up in university or something like that. I don't know if that's the best way to think about it, but kids, when they're growing up, they need, dedicated care from people who love them and know what they are at that age and all of that. And if that has to come in a daycare setting, a childcare setting, then it needs to be of decent quality. But I'm not sure that, if you had like the really good curriculum, then they turn out to be more upstanding citizens. I don't know if that's even a useful question.
I'd love to hear a woman ask a question. If you've got one, pressure's on. This is Rachel's dad. He gets special dispensation right now. And then a woman. I'm giving you one more.
Rachel has a look of dread as her father approaches the And no, we didn't rehearse this question, but mine is, what are some of the more promising areas of common ground across the political spectrum currently, if any?
Well, I'm hoping it's childcare as one of them. But I think we have, childcare is one of what's often considered a family of policies that support families and children. And so the child tax credit is a really important piece of that. It goes directly to families. Paid family leave is another piece of that. It enables parents to provide care for their children after they've been born. We would love to see paid leave offered to end-of-life caregivers as well. And then childcare is a third. So together they make kind of a holistic trio of support for families. And on the whole, I think those are supported on both sides of the aisle. Maybe the childcare tax credit the most, some folks on paid family leave. But I think conversations like this are essential, and the work of some of you in this room is essential to bringing childcare into that common ground space as well.
I'm not the child, so I don't have to answer. I would just say one thing, though. In the post-Dobbs era, I think that's made a lot of people think about what about these children if they're going to be children that are raised, the moms need support. So I think that's opened up a few eyes. I wonder if this makes sense, Rachel, that one of the problems at the moment is that not much legislating is being done in Congress of any kind. And, on a topic that needs real careful, detailed work, this just doesn't seem like a particularly good time for it. On the other hand, I think for legislators who see that things need to happen, I hope some of them just kind of say, okay, all that yelling is going to happen up there, but let's use some of our time to dig into what needs to be done for the future. We can pray for that.
Well, I got 4. So we might be even, unless there's a sister who would like to ask a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. Phoebe Meyer from the Center for Christianity and Public Life. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about childcare deserts and kind of what leads to specific geographic areas that don't have a lot of childcare options and the different inequalities and barriers, and how we might be able to think about overcoming and incentivizing more childcare options in those areas.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I do want to say is that childcare deserts is kind of a numerical designation. Numbers of children in a region to numbers of providers. And so there is an interim step that isn't accounted for in a lot of those maps, which is how many households are actually seeking childcare. So it's a very important kind of metric to help us think about where to focus efforts. But I do want to be cautious a little bit about that that model. And I with that I actually want to pivot to work that scholars affiliated with the Center for Public Justice did on childcare deserts and childcare need in Iowa. And I don't think we have it with us, but it's really a helpful on-the-ground study, particularly for Hispanic families in Iowa. And I think what they were most interested in were 2 things. One, the challenge of having childcare in rural regions, right? You might have a center, but then families may have to drive a really far distance to get to that, to reach that center. And so home-based care or even congregation-based care might be more accessible, but there may be reasons why barriers for folks providing it. And then the second is culturally meaningful care. And that can actually be a kind of desert that isn't even contemplated by those maps. So I think that's a really good piece to look at when we're thinking about childcare deserts.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think part of the conceptual difficulty too is that parents may the most useful childcare may not be close to home, but close to work. And then how do you actually see that? That's really hard to map, I think. One of our colleagues at the center works in San Antonio with Hispanic churches, and they can see through the kind of web-based index of services and so on where the child care providers are, and they're not in Hispanic neighborhoods. And so there's clearly a desert there, both just in terms of child care providers of any kind, but then those who are, particularly valued and trusted by that community. And so churches are thinking about how they could step in to fill that, because they have facilities and a desire to do something with their neighbors and also economically positive. It turns out that even in a very red state that in many ways encourages the involvement of faith-based organizations, they haven't taken some, I think, fairly easy steps that would help these churches feel like they're welcome in the system. And why they do that, or don't do that, I'm not quite sure. But I think there's a gap there that we hope to help fill, both from the side of the churches and then also talking to public officials. But there would be a case where it's both, no slots available, as it were, but also nothing that would be particularly attractive to these families. So something new needs to be developed. And one thing I think our research showed is that some of the workforce development centers, because childcare is tied up with the workforce development in Texas, and you go to the workforce development website to find subsidized childcare. It seems like some of these centers, these regional development offices, they say, well, we have enough providers signed up, given how much subsidies we have, so we're just going to stop asking. But that means any place that there's currently not an appropriate kind of service will never get filled up if they're not recruiting more, right? So that's one piece of our advice to them will be to let more providers in and not just say, we think there's enough of them, because they're not necessarily the right kind in the right places.
Thank you for your questions. And can we thank these two for their work tonight? We are grateful for the gift of your presence. You probably found a card on your chair that has little QR codes on it. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, we would love to stay in touch with you. So please do that. There is a opportunity that we have to continue this conversation a little bit. So for a few more minutes in this room, if you want to stick around, not on the mic. And we're grateful. Thank you for coming tonight.